Hi, everybody, and welcome to Evenings with an Author at the American Library in Paris, sponsored by Grow at Annenberg. I'm Rachel Donadio, the Curator of Cultural Programs here at the library, and I'm delighted this evening to have with us novelist Lauren Elkin and writer and scholar Dan Medin to discuss Lauren's new novel, Scaffolding. The two of them will be in conversation for about 45 minutes, and then we will open up the floor to questions from you, our audience here, and then, if there's time, also from some of the people who are listening in on Zoom. Lauren Elkin is the author of several books, including Flâneuse, Women Walk the City, a Radio 4 Book of the Week, a New York Times Notable Book of 2017, and a finalist for the PEN Diamonstein-Spielvogel Award for the Art of the Essay. Her essays on art, literature, and culture have appeared in the London Review of Books, the New York Times, Granta, Harper's, Le Monde, Les Inrockuptibles, and Frieze, among others. She is also an award-winning translator, most recently of Simone de Beauvoir's previously unpublished novel, The Inseparables, Les Inseparables. No, it has a different title in French. No. After 20 years in Paris, she now lives in London. And Daniel Medin is an editor and professor of comparative literature at the American University in Paris. Please join me in giving them a warm round of applause.
Thanks, Rachel, and thanks, everyone, for being here. Lauren, at the end of this novel, it's got these dates, 2007 to 2023, and a list of different addresses in the city of Paris where you wrote this novel over time. Now, I know it's not your first novel, because I recall that there was something that had appeared in French at some point. But can you say something about this particular history and the history of writing this novel, which is to say, we're going to get into, I think, we'll go into greater detail into things that interest me about the relationship between nonfiction, which you're very well known for, and your recent books are works of nonfiction, and fiction. Also about place, which is obviously, it's an itinerary of places that you've lived in the city and the different arrondissements. Can you just say something about the history of writing this novel? And I don't know if that's a question about what the germ was, but I'm more interested rather than its origin in its development.
Yeah, thank you, Daniel, for agreeing to do this, and thank you, Rachel, and everybody here at the library for welcoming me back. I'm so happy to be here, and yeah, I had like a very large glass of red wine, so hopefully this is just going to flow. But yeah, it's really nice to be here with Dan, who's a friend of mine, and Rachel's a friend of mine. It's just like I feel very, like I'm home. But yeah, so as I've listed at the back of the book, I couldn't tell you why it just came out, that list came out in the same kind of like weird, fever dream that the rest of the novel came out in. But it felt like in a book that's so much about place and a particular place in Paris, this apartment in Belleville, it felt kind of natural or an extension of the novel almost to offer an accounting of the places where I wrote it. A lot of the book is in dialogue with the Anglo-Irish novelist Elizabeth Bowen, who is one of my favorite writers. I don't know if there's any Bowen fans out there. The House in Paris is my blueprint for this book. And Bowen said in an interview that she was very surprised that people didn't ask her more about place. And she said, "Am I not manifestly a writer for whom places loom large?" And I think that's probably the sort of one of the reasons that I like vibe so much with Bowen is that she's interested in character and situations and language, but above all, she's trying to get at what it feels like to be in a particular place. And just on its own, place is not enough for a book. You need a situation, you need some kind of drama or conflict or something that, gets it off the ground. But I think fundamentally, I'm interested in writing about what it feels like to be in a place. And that list of addresses is a kind of, it's my trajectory in Paris. I can't even remember, what's the first one that I even put on the list. I first lived in Paris in 1999 and was living on Avenue de Saxe.
Rue Monge, was it?
Rue Monge, is that the first one? Or because I started this book on Rue des Lyonnais in the 5th. But like I used to live upstairs from here for one summer at 10 Rue du Général Camus. But this book was born at 5 Rue des Lyonnais, and then it sort of took shape as I moved from place to place over a period of 16 years. And 16 years because, on one hand, partly because I wrote it in French and in English. Like there's a French original manuscript that's not a translation. It's an original manuscript. And so that took a long time. But also because, as you know, you have to make your living however you can when you're, a writer / academic / critic / whatever, portfolio career, I think is what they call it. And I was making my living teaching at AUP, teaching at NYU, and doing my PhD, and then writing Flâneuse. And it was very hard to prioritize writing fiction because that's something they don't pay you for up front. You just have to kind of do it in your furtive moments that you can kind of catch at. So, when I wasn't doing the work that brings in, whatever money it does, I was writing this fiction. So yeah, it was a long-term labor of love.
It's funny because you do talk about Bowen in the novel, and I think we'd talked about her fiction previously. But what really struck me in here was, I suppose, the presence of Georges Perec. And I don't want to alienate anybody in the audience here because I want to basically move from reading place to writing place, which is what you do here. And in particular, you do that with Belleville, a particular part of Paris, in the 20th arrondissement, which you know well. Some of this is mediated through my readings of other readings of your work, different works, where it's quite explicit that debt to Perec, or at least, if not debt, kinship, in terms of writing about the same neighborhood, even if that neighborhood has gone a pretty substantial overhaul since the time that Perec had actually lived there. Could you say something about that particular aspect of reading about Belleville, or being aware of a writer, or perhaps other writers, from the same neighborhood that you yourself have lived in and that you're going to attempt to chronicle?
I feel like this question goes to the heart of why we, for instance, visit writers' houses. Why is it like a thing that we do, or say you're going on vacation to Cornwall, maybe you read Daphne du Maurier in Cornwall. Like we have this sense that works are connected to the places where they were written or the places where they're set in some way. And so it feels like meaningful to go and see Virginia Woolf's house, in Sussex, go to Monk's house and like see the writing shed. And so I think for me in Belleville, it was more a case of like I moved there because circumstances put me there, not because I was particularly trying to move to Belleville, but I was trying to buy an apartment with my ex, and we could afford Belleville, and we knew lots of people in Belleville, and there were cute little coffee shops in Belleville, so we were like, all right, I guess that's where we're going to move. That's where we're going to live. And so we, we're part of that particular wave of gentrifiers in that neighborhood. And then you're there and you have to cope with the kind of socioeconomic situation that has brought you to be there and, makes you kind of feel a particular way. I think Belleville is probably, at the same time, it's an interesting place to think about the kind of different ways that people have found to end up there, because it's such a historically mixed place. It's a place where, for instance, as you all will know very well, I say this to British people all the time in these events, and they're like, but you guys know for sure. It's a place where 4 arrondissements come together, the 10th, the 11th, the 19th, and the 20th. It's a crossroads. And it has this great history of being a working class kind of stronghold, a quartier populaire, not originally part of Paris, just a kind of village off on its own, up on the hill, where people would go up to get drunk in the guignette and then kind of roll down the hill back to their respectable lives at the end of the night. And then was just such a terre d'asile, like a place where immigrants came from lots of different places to kind of coexist in a way that, from my experience living in Belleville, was kind of exemplary. You have so many different people from different places, just kind of, cheek by jowl, either ignoring each other or getting on famously. And so to be part of that wave of gentrifiers in Belleville didn't feel as alienating or as much of an imposition on the neighborhood as it might have felt elsewhere. Where I live in southeast London is very close to Peckham, as we were talking about. And Peckham is a place that I think is an example of gentrification kind of sitting very ill at ease with the people who were there before, the like young people with their artisanal coffee and their, you know, hipster outfits. And so I guess what I'm trying to say about Belleville is that it was open to me to read. There was so much happening, and it sort of could take shape for me as a person living there by reading about its history. It became more meaningful as I learned about, you know, Perec, or there's a great book, God, what is it called? It's like Une Planète Belleville, something like that. Une Planète Belleville. And it's a kind of compendium of interviews with people who've lived in Belleville over, you know, 70 years or something, and kind of attest to the way that it's changed. And I drew on that book for some of the conversations that Henri, for instance, overhears in 1972 as they're knocking down the little village at Place des Fêtes and building up those big, like, monstrosities. But anyway, all of that is just to say that Belleville, more than other places, or in a different way to other places, seems like a place that invites you to read it and to engage with its history and to think about the way it's working and fitting together. And it doesn't seem, in my experience anyway, kind of hostile to people from the outside, whether that's, you know, people from the middle class or people from a different country, people from America, whatever. You know, without wanting to like sentimentalize it and say it's so welcoming, it really just feels like people are kind of living together from different places and disparate backgrounds and just kind of getting on with things.
Well, I think it's also refreshing to read a novel about Paris, and, you know, there are a few of them out there. Not all of them written in English, right? I mean, but there are, you know, the majority of them are often set in certain locations and that are closer to the Seine, we might say. And so it's refreshing to read a novel, which is, I suppose this is a solipsistic thing, which is in my neighborhood, you know, and of course you recognize the different locations, you recognize the different transformations, you can see the things that have been happening to it. But this is a nice transition into something else that I wanted to ask you about, which has to do with historical factors. And of course, it's not an accident that Perec was living there, and of course history was a powerful influence on his own biography and the sorts of things that he writes about, and that seems to be something that's of importance to you, at least in the life of one particular character in the novel. And I'm thinking of Jonathan, although I suppose you could say more widely, you know, of course it's set in a very specific place and time, and there are ways in which it corresponds, the details corresponds to it. And I wouldn't go so far as to claim that there's an extensive meditation or grappling with questions of history and trauma, but it's certainly one of the dilemmas that influence the relationship of Jonathan to, I would say, probably everyone, although that can be narrowed down a little bit more. Can you say something about the importance of history in your construction of the character? And I don't know if this is an extension of it, and I'm sorry to give you a kind of clustered question, but there's a way that through the character, there's an attempt to work through some aspects of, I suppose, Jewish identity and Jewish history in a big international city like Paris.
I will say that the one title that I played with that I discarded pretty quickly on because it was kind of non-specific, but I was thinking of calling it From Before. And I was interested in this novel in writing about, like, the before, like everything that came before, whether that's like past relationships or, you know, just stuff that's happened to us in our individual lives, or, you know, history and trauma and things that were experienced by people that we know, but not necessarily to us directly. And obviously, you know, the Holocaust is a really good example of that for people who are Jewish. And it was born also of having lived in France for such a long time and having been interested in the French Jewish community from the outset. I was like, the first gig that I had here as a journalist was as a correspondent for the Jewish Telegraphic Agency. And I was reporting on all the terrible anti-Semitism that was happening in France. This is the early noughties. So like 2002, 2003, 2004. And just got really interested in the Jewish community here and their history and what it meant to like live in a place where, you know, a couple of generations ago, like people you see on the street, their grandparents were like putting your grandparents on the trains. And what does that do to you? And so constructing Jonathan's sense of himself, like in this relationship with Anna, where he breaks up with her because she's not Jewish, but then goes through behind the scenes, because Anna doesn't see Jonathan for, 15 years or something. He marries an Israeli girl and they get divorced, and then he ends up with Clémentine, who's not a Jew at all. And Anna then meets him again in that new version of his life and is like, but Clémentine isn't Jewish. Like, how did you go from breaking up with me because I wasn't Jewish to dating this girl who's like such a shiksa? And I wanted to think about, without like belaboring the point, to think about what Jonathan might have gone through in his life to, it's not that he like worked it out and resolved his kind of inherited trauma. It's that he's just trying out different answers to it, different ways of coping with it. And it's a complete like open question for him. And I was really interested in the work of the French psychoanalyst Nathalie Zajde, who has kind of looked at the descendants of Holocaust survivors and looked at the ways in which their dreams are often like the same as, echoes of the dreams of people who actually went through the camps. So there's this idea that goes, it's outside of like research on the Holocaust, but like there's this idea that trauma is kind of passed down in the DNA, that something happens to the DNA, it reforms, and then it is somehow passed down in a family. So the question where the whole novel is concerned is really like, what do we do with the things that we've been through? Like, do we keep them to ourselves? Do we try to, cordon them off from going beyond ourselves? Is that even possible? Or do we kind of, relax and just let the stories flow? I don't know. Henri in 1972 is a really interesting example of this, because he just can't, he doesn't want to see a therapist. He doesn't want his wife to talk to him about his past. He's the son of someone who survived the Holocaust and then took his own life after. He just doesn't want it to be part of his identity. He just wants to be like franco-français, like that, and that's just it. Like he says at one point, like, look at me, I'm a good citizen of the Republic. I have earned my pension and my country house, and my summers by the sea. Like, leave me alone.
It's interesting because there's on the one hand we have this this preoccupation with you can say ghosts, with the way the spirit in time and its hauntings by what had preceded it. It has a material parallel in the book, and it's suggested by the title itself that you did choose, which is to say scaffolding, which on the one hand we have a situation in which a house is being remade, but constantly you seem to be thinking about the pasts that different spaces host and the interaction of human minds and grappling with those pasts in both people and in the buildings, and things being made and being remade, or being unmade to be remade. And of course, within this, I mean, it's funny because we're talking about some of these larger issues, but this is, as you've already suggested, even just in terms of your identification of characters, this is largely a novel about relationships. And the way couples interact with one another and entertain thoughts. Maybe that's a euphemism for of escaping from the other, and so on and so forth. But can you say something about like that material aspect of scaffolding? It's a conceit that is more or less dominant, both in the prior historical period as well as the more recent one in the setting. You seem very concerned as an author with describing the transformation of the apartment, the remaking of the apartment, and what the scaffolding itself might possibly represent in terms of intrusions, something that's momentarily there, that's between what precedes it and its new beginnings. Do you want to say something about scaffolding, maybe, as
sure.
you can see, because I'm getting embarrassed about just riffing on it.
That's okay. No, it's all. You would be surprised how much riffing about scaffolding I hear during these events, or not. No, it's all good. The origin of the book, you might not at all be surprised to hear this, was that I was living in a building that was being refaced in 2007. Have you guys had this? Your building's being ravelé, and it's just like, it changes the fabric of everyday life to have your building being refaced. It's just like constant, non-stop.
Your bank account too.
Sorry?
Your bank account too.
Oh yeah, your bank account too. Absolutely. It's expensive and it's loud, and I didn't have to pay for it because I was a renter at that point, but I had to pay for it in my sweat and tears, and my dog barking every day, just incessantly at the workmen. So it was born of trying to capture like the particular existential experience of having your building ravelé in Paris. But I was also reading a lot of Lacan at that point. I was in grad school, and thinking about Lacan's theory of lack, that we come into subjectivity at the moment in infancy when we look in the mirror and realize that we're separate from our mothers, the mirror stage moment, where we had previously thought that like we're just like one big like infinite lump of love. And then you kind of have this moment where you're like, oh, I'm me, and this is where I begin and I end, and mommy is separate, and like I've lost something. So we become ourselves. That coincides with the moment when we come into language. We come into language and we come into ourselves by losing something that seems so precious to us. And so I wanted to write about like those two things coming together, this idea of like lack and longing, and like, God, I just want things, and it's so loud. What am I going to do about this? And so it felt kind of natural to then write about interiority and domesticity and like coupledom, where we go to like, I think a lot of us go to relationships to find that missing thing, find the missing mommy, but like also fulfill through sex and through love and companionship, fulfill that missing thing. And then the thing that, you find that I write about in the book is that like, actually, it's super important for this couple to succeed that they actually remain an other, that they not be some like mother that's subsumed into the self, but like separate from you and distinct from you. And so that's I think there's like a Cixous quote, that your lover must remain absolutely other, otherwise it's not going to work. So yeah, in terms of scaffolding, I guess I was thinking through these logics of supplementarity and otherness, and what to do with that gap. How do you mediate the gap? So Anna tries lots of different ways of mediating it. She tries like, her husband goes to work in London, and so she's on her own, and she tries out being with Jonathan again. She tries out being with Clémentine, like anything to try to like buttress her feeling of having no center and having no self. And all that happens really is that the scaffolding comes down.
Well, other things happen as well, but first I want to talk about something, because in bringing up Lacan, you suggest something that is one of the most I'd say compelling aspects of the novel, and it's not Lacan. It's the way that you set ideas into practice. You spent a lot of time as an essayist talking about ideas. You've written a doctorate. You're conversant in many different things, and it's interesting the way that ideas are integrated into the fiction. It's a fiction that's preoccupied in different ways with things that interest you, which is least visible to me, which is to say psychology. And it serves its purpose in the fiction, which is to say it's not just there because it wants to be there, and while there may be symbolic resonance to it, these are the characters, this is what they're coming from, and that's why it's justified by the novel. But also, I think, film. I mean, you've referred to the kind of influence or interest in what Rohmer was doing in cinema and talking about relationships and fidelity and morality through his films. There's a preoccupation with these things and a way of integrating them into the story that's quite interesting to me, because it feels inherently different from what you would do in nonfiction, which is something that you practice quite regularly. Can you say something about even the things that we say about history? I mean, some of the great writing in here too. I like the line about history avec sa grande H, which is another aspect of this. There are ideas, but they're serving the story. But what's the challenge of actually doing that and ensuring that they serve the story rather than advertising themselves? Which is to say, is being part, not so much of announcing ideas about this is what Lacan thinks about relationships, and I agree with this or I disagree with this, or the character's behavior is going to illustrate it in this way or that way, but rather that somehow the ideas are grappled with, they're discussed, they're worked through, they're thought through, but on the terms of the way that the characters are interacting.
That's a really good question. I think as a nonfiction writer, I had sort of felt like there were only so many things I could say, or maybe I'm limited by my own kind of imagination as a nonfiction writer in terms of what I could do with it. I think there are a lot of really good creative writers working in nonfiction. I'm thinking of Ryan Ruby, for instance, who's got a book coming out called Context Collapse, which looks really good.
Is that the Ringbahn book?
The what? Sorry?
He was going to write a book about, I haven't seen him in a while, but he was going to write a book about this circular ring around Berlin.
No, I think
it's
it's
a different
one.
project. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
This is a book about poetry, and I just hearing him, talk about it, like he has a more creative sort of approach to nonfiction than I do, or something. I don't know, or maybe I'm just a very literal person. But like, if I were going to write about Lacan, it would probably be deadly boring. Like, it would be really academic and like really premier degré. Like, this is what I want to argue about Lacan, and it didn't. I think I reached a point where that didn't feel like worth doing, because like loads of people have written on Lacan and will keep writing about Lacan, and God bless them. But it didn't. I think something I'm concerned with as a writer is doing something that only I can do, that like can only come out of my particular stew of readings and preoccupations and ways of thinking about the world. And so I think that's why I didn't want to just write like a nonfiction thing about Lacan. I may write a nonfiction thing about Rohmer if I can have the time and like the kind of freedom of, I don't know, like my brain is like too overloaded at the moment to have room for Rohmer, but like I have a lot to say about Rohmer, so I may say it. But Lacan, I felt like I wanted to kind of like think about living Lacan instead of writing about him, kind of write through him and see what he offered. I was telling you before, I'm translating this biography of Louise Bourgeois, who spent a lot of time in therapy, although she later denied it. She, like, if you asked her, about her 20 years in therapy, she'd be like, what are you talking about? I've never been in therapy. And she says somewhere in her diaries that Lacan is both a guérisseur and a con man. It's in French and English in the diaries. So he's like a healer and he's a total con man. And I think that's such an interesting way to think about him. That's how I feel about him. There's a lot to say.
Lucky therapist, because, many of them don't even get the healer bit,
Yeah, exactly. She liked Charcot because he was a scientist. She was not so sure about Lacan and Freud because they were theorists. But she liked that Lacan was a healer. She felt like he healed. So I hadn't read that when I was writing this novel, but it's an interesting way of thinking about Lacan and what he has to offer us. It's not so much, like, for me anyway, on the level of what he's saying. It's like, how does it help us live our lives better? And then there's the Rohmer stuff, which was something I was thinking about in terms of an aesthetic, something that I love, or like a way of living, even like a technology for living. Like, I love about his films the way that people are just like, they're just getting on with their lives. They're not, I mean, an important part of this is that he was writing long before like Instagram, for instance. So these are not curated lives. These are not curated apartments. People are just kind of living for the day. I have a hard time, I'm still trying to articulate this. I think this is why I think I still need to write about Rohmer. But a film like Full Moon in Paris, Les Nuits de la Pleine Lune, it's this young woman who's trying to like figure out how she wants to live. She's got this nice boyfriend she likes a lot who lives in the suburbs, and she lives with him most of the time, but also she really likes to go out with her friends in Paris. And so she has this apartment that has been sublet, but it's recently become free. And so she decides to try this experiment in living where she's going to live part-time with the boyfriend in the suburbs, this very dreary modernist apartment building. And then like a couple nights a week, she's going to go out clubbing with her friends and then crash at her own place. And it's so guileless. She just like wakes up in the morning and makes her coffee on the mocha and then like gets out her rotary phone and calls up to see like, is Fabrice Lucchini around today? Are we going to hang out? And, you know, it's this, I know it's like a fantasy of like what life in Paris used to be, but it has a kind of simplicity that I think is typical of his films and the way that people talk and exchange with each other and go through the day. So I don't know if this is a nostalgia for like a time before phones, but I know that it's connected to Paris. And I have found it like in an Airbnb I stayed in a couple of weeks ago where like there was no microwave, there was no washing machine. It was just like this bare bones apartment the way it would have been in 1972. And it was great. It's hard for me to put my finger on what this is that I'm trying to say, which is why I'm kind of talking in a circle. But there's something about just like living life as life that I see, that I take from Rohmer's films, and that I think is what Anna is trying to do in her slightly misguided, slightly painful way.
I think also art, I mean, something that you've written about extensively makes its way into this novel. And at one point, we were talking about, you know, the place of my birth, Waterbury, Connecticut. And actually there's another, we were talking about the literary connections. Well, plural is maybe exaggerating a little bit. But the literary connection to Waterbury. But there's also an artistic one, because there's one museum there, it's the Mattituck Museum, and they have a large collection of Case Age, who actually lived in Woodbury, which is near Waterbury, Connecticut, among the few surrealist, you know, women painters of the time who belonged to the movement, part of it through marriage, but of course I was blown away just on the basis of what I saw there. I found it much more interesting than the work of her husband, and it pleased me just to see the name in here, even if you made this nice link to Montaigne, you know, and what do I know with her name in French, but and this is maybe more common because how often do I get to, you know, this is part of what makes reading a pleasure, is to come across these little bits of your own experience, and you're confirmed far away many years later. And that's just one aspect of the way this book is preoccupied with visual culture. Another one, and it's maybe in the realm of activism, is the role of the Flâneuse, which, as an inhabitant of Belleville for years, I also saw these things as they went up. And I suppose I'm going to ask you a very banal question. Did you undertake research to document the methods or the procedure? I know that you mention a documentary in this novel. It's part of this one character who's a very lively and vivid, she's wonderfully rendered in here, Clémentine, that you mentioned earlier, belongs to this group that is putting up these feminist messages, not just feminist messages, actually, they're about femicide, trying to bring it to the attention of a larger public. And that's also part of the scaffolding of this novel, not just because the character's involved with it, but it's the environment, it's the atmosphere, it's also where they live. Can you say so? I'm just curious, between us, you know, was this something that you just observed? You watched a documentary? Did you take a deep dive? Like, can you say about, tell me about if there was research that went into your representation of that in this novel?
The Flâneuse came in really late. I was writing that section in the next to last chapter where Anna goes on a really long walk through Paris. And by that point in the trajectory of writing the novel, I was living in London, and I had to kind of in my mind's eye, picture where she'd be walking to walk from Belleville down to Notre Dame. And it was a kind of stream of consciousness. It's a kind of stream of consciousness kind of style. And she's kind of noticing things and then moving on. And then I just wrote in one of these collage, and like Tu n'es pas seul or something like that. And then as I was kind of reading over what I'd written, I was like, oh, that's interesting. Because it was also kind of fuzzy in terms of when it was set, because I'd started writing it in 2007. So it was originally set in 2007. And then it kind of moved forward with me as I aged. It was always contemporary to me. And then at a certain point when I was like, I got to finish this goddamn novel if it kills me, I was like, well, it has to be after the attacks in 2015 because that felt very important to me in my life in Paris. I don't know if you guys have felt that way, but it felt like it changed something. And so it felt like the novel had to be after that. It had to be after the Gilets jaunes, sorry. Sorry, there's whenever I see like little kids wearing their little high-vis jackets, I always think Gilets jaunes, but it's Gilets jaunes, sorry. Anyway, and so I was like, well, the Flâneuse, that's actually really interesting that came out. I knew that Clémentine was like, because she was written as she is, like she's kind of young, activist, whatever. But I was like, oh, if she's with the Flâneuse, that gives her like a much more kind of concrete like way of being an activist and a thing for her to be kind of on Anna's back about and trying to get Anna out of the house because Anna's like sitting in her house depressed about having had a miscarriage. It like gave a whole kind of other dimension to Clémentine's character to have, her be a Flâneuse. So I did the deep dive watching the documentary and reading everything that I could find about them and like looking at their Instagram posts, but I didn't like go out and like hang out with them or anything. Yeah, no, I didn't do, that like guerrilla journalism thing, which, maybe I should have, but was in London, have a 6-year-old. It was a little hard.
Well, as you say, you lived in London. You live in London. You've left us here some years ago, and
3 years ago.
It feels like a long time.
I know.
It feels like a long
another
time.
era.
Yeah. I suppose one question I have is, of course, you're only here for a couple of days. You do visit now and again. I'd be curious to hear some perspective from the other side. It might seem as though this could be a novel, A Tale of Two Cities, but I don't think London is really a foil. That just happens to be the place that the other character is located, and that just also happens to be a place where one of the protagonists goes at some point to visit with him, and there's some observations about it, but it's not really in contrast to, and it certainly doesn't compete with Paris as the center, as the central location of this novel, as the essential setting of the novel. I wonder about the contrast for you, having moved away, the way that Paris feels coming back. And I suppose there's the cheap version of that is your impressions of the city and its surface. I suppose the deeper version of it is what's happened to Paris since you have left, that remains in your mind, that you're confronted with even more directly when you come back to the actual thing.
Paris seems much the same. It almost feels like I'm returning to my real life. Like living in London is just traveling, or like some kind of that's like time out from. It's really hard to describe. It feels very much just like I'm back to my life now. Or I was thinking today, it's like putting my glasses on. Like it just feels normal. It feels like it's the right rhythm. It's the right size. I come here and I realize like how much of an effort it is to live in London. Like living there is not easy, and it's like I was wearing those ankle weights, and just like I get here and it's like I take them off and it's like, oh, I didn't realize those were on. It's just so much easier to be here, and I cannot overstate how much I prefer it here. But that's no surprise to anyone who knows my work, who's read this book. But London's fine. London is a good city. It's mostly. And when Anna goes to London, she can't help but contrast it with Paris, because this guy that she talks to at the boulangerie is like, an old school Parisian who's like fetching about how he doesn't want to learn, he wants to learn Greek, but he doesn't want to do it with a bot on an app. Like, he wants to talk to a real Greek person. And so Anna goes to London, and it feels like London's the land of like apps and like, aggressively artisanal bread and sour coffee.
Expression that I liked. There's several of them in this novel. Yeah.
Like London it's not a foil for Paris, but it's a city that's kept pace with contemporaneity. And Paris has not. And I know that like Macron, for instance, hates that and is like doing his very best
to modernize Gare du Nord. It's too
exactly.
late. It's
to modernize everything.
But,
yeah. The man wants Paris to be London so badly. And in some, I think like groceries are more expensive and cabs are more expensive, and those things are not Macron's fault. It's just inflation. But like, fundamentally Paris seems much the same. Although I do have a friend who recently left Paris for Marseille because she said Paris is a little too like millennial pink right now. And she's chasing authenticity
to
Marseille.
That was the Olympics.
Yeah, exactly.
That aggressively artisanal bread is one of an example of the pleasures of the writing as well. I saw another sentence here about Clémentine and her friends are also pretty and committed, like militant fairies, and there are all sorts of these little writing pleasures scattered throughout the novel, and so I want to thank you for those. I think we're at the point where, unfortunately for myself, because I like to keep asking questions, but where we can open things up to responses and questions from those who are here. For Lauren.
I have a question for you. Did you dress to match my book, or is this just what you wear every day?
I thought it was going to be a lot colder. I think some of this is just functional, It's like you want to get every bit of sun, absorbed by what you're wearing in this kind of climate. And I wasn't trying to pair up with your characters from the 70s or anything like that.
It's just the black and the brown. It works.
So, do we have any questions? Hello. I wanted to return to what you were talking about, the readability of Paris. And I was wondering if you were influenced by French writers, because I know that that's something that's kind of treated a lot in French literature.
Hugely, yeah. It's funny, people have been asking me that the other way around a lot recently, how do I think of myself as an American writer? And my answer is often not. I lived in America for the first 20 years of my life and was not a writer, and then I moved to France and became a writer. And I think that's because there's this tradition here. I'm thinking of people like Georges Perec or Annie Ernaux or Marguerite Duras of just kind of making narrative out of whatever. I think coming from a tradition where the great novel was like Philip Roth or Don DeLillo or, older than that, Nathaniel Hawthorne or Melville, whatever. It's just so big and monumental and about multinational corporations and just it's so huge and unwieldy, and my brain can't deal with it. But I can deal with daily life, and that's where Perec, I think, was reading him for the first time in the late noughties was huge for me, because it was you can write an essay out of everything you ate and drank during the period of a year. Okay, that sounds good. But even I went back to The Lover recently and was this is so different from what an American memoir would be. First of all, everything in France is a novel. Even if it's what would be in America called a memoir, here it's c'est un roman. So L'Amant, we don't know about the degree of its fictionality versus reality, but I could see that being a memoir in America. But it would never include reflections on women who had their heads shaved during during the purging after the Second World War. It goes places that it shouldn't be allowed to go because it's off topic. And so I think as an American, I was just sort of told that this is what literature was, and then I moved here and I was like, oh, literature can be like a short, intense book about your abortion. I like that. I think I can work with that. So yeah, that's how I ended up here. Thank you for the question.
It's fascinating that you began the book in French, and I'm curious, was there a point in time where you were writing in both languages, and what made you make the switch? Or it sounds like you have a complete manuscript actually in French too, so why did you pursue its publication in English, and what was that process?
When I started writing this book in 2007, I was living a very French life. Like, I had a French partner, was doing a French PhD, like had all French friends. You know, it felt, you know, as opposed to my life now where my partner's American and we live in London, like I was deeply immersed in the French language, and it just came out in French. Like, I was writing about people here, and so they talk to each other in French. But I'm still me, you know, with my brain that was born and raised in New York. So a lot of the writing also came out in English. So I realized that I would just I thought it might be like useful as a writer to just like let it go in each language and to see what came and not like commit to one or the other. And then as I was going forward, I was like, well, I kind of like doing this. I think I want it to exist in both languages. And then over time, I had this weird experience where a novel that I wrote in English was translated and came out in French, and nobody wanted to publish it in America or the UK. So it came out here, and I was like, this is not how I sound when I speak French. It was very like lofty, you know, très soutenu, like very like not me. And I thought, well, now I feel even more committed to like finishing this manuscript in French and like seeing what I sound like as a French writer. And so when I was done with the French version, I sent it to a French friend who was a writer, and she was like, it's interesting. C'est très original. She was like, it's like a French, not like from another time, but from like another place. So, you know, I had a couple of other French writer friends like work with me on it to norm it a bit. So hopefully it sounds less like, I think it's okay. I don't know yet. We'll see if anyone wants to publish it here. But it's a weird kind of experience of looking at how, like, for instance, I'm thinking about the writer Jean Rhys, who, when she was first learning to write, her mentor, Ford Madox Ford, was like, if a sentence isn't working, try to translate it into French. And if you still don't know what you're trying to say, like, let it go. And I think that, you know, in the end, like, it was a good kind of exercise to see if I could make sense of what I was trying to say in both languages. And if it didn't work in French, I'd translate it into English, and then that would help me get, you know, clarity on it in French. Anyway, I think I tend to live my life as like a dual national, bilingual, two countries, whatever. So like when one's not making sense, you can go to the other. So anyway, I'm not sure I would do this again, that said, but it was a learning experience.
Well, we have a question for somebody on Zoom from Catherine. I read the cover of Scaffolding came from a painting you saw. Can you talk about how visual arts impacts and inspires your writing, and how you approach visual arts in different ways throughout the process of writing and editing this book?
Yeah, the cover is by an American painter called Shannon Cartier-Lucy. And I came across her work, I think, on Instagram. I'm pretty sure on Instagram, and was just floored by it. I mean, this amazing image of this woman with these swans in a bag. It was just so surreal and also kind of realist at the same time. And that was a kind of feeling that I was trying to capture in the book. It's not a work of like surrealist literature by any stretch, but it was meant to be a little bit kind of off in terms of its relationship to reality. Like at one point, a like perfectly sectioned grapefruit just appears on a counter. But the role that the art had in the book, and this was like unique to this book, I don't know that this necessarily will be something that I repeat in the future, but the painter, Shannon Cartier-Lucy, has a bunch of different paintings, any of which could have been the cover of this book. And I loved them so much that I ended up integrating them into the book itself. So there's one scene that ends up being recurrent in the novel where Anna says she feels like she's cling filmed to the couch. And that image comes from a painting that Lucy did. And then there are other moments in the book that either come from her paintings, or there's a scene towards the end where there's a vernissage and Clémentine, it turns out, is an artist's model. And some of the paintings that Clémentine poses for are paintings by Shannon Cartier-Lucy. So I was integrating art into the book in a very explicit way to kind of generate writing and generate scenes for these characters, just as a way to, like, I really just resonated with these paintings, and it was a way kind of into the paintings, but also to let the paintings kind of help me unpack the, like, emotional situation of the book. So art had, like, a very practical and concrete kind of role for me as I was going, and Shannon Cartier-Lucy's paintings, you know, in particular. So yeah.
You have another question?
Thank you so much for coming here today. So in Art Monsters, and please, like, correct me if I'm misspeaking, but in Art Monsters you talk about how you use form in a very, like, expansive and non-traditional way to be able to express the themes that you're trying to communicate. And I got that sense in Scaffolding as well. So I just wanted to hear a little bit more about that.
Thank you. Yeah, that's great. And thank you for reading Art Monsters. Yeah, so I alluded to Elizabeth Bowen before. She has this novel called The House in Paris from 1935. And that novel is structured in 3 parts. Parts 1 and part 3 are set in the present day, 1934, let's say. And then the middle section bends back 10 years prior to look at how the people in the present day sort of came to be in their circumstances. So that is the kind of structure and form of this novel. I decided to make parts 1 and 3 in 2019, as it turned out, and then have part 2 be set at some point earlier that could then allow me not to talk directly about the characters in the present day, but that would let me to kind of explore, you know, it's set in the same apartment, so, like, the kind of energies that might be drifting around the apartment, and it allowed me to kind of contrast explicitly the way that a marriage would have worked in 2019 as opposed to 1972, the way that feminism would have shaped the wife's kind of conception of, like, her role in the relationship and how to manage her discontents and her longings to look elsewhere, as they both do, Anna and Florence. So yeah, I think I set out to think about, to use kind of Bowen's structure, Bowen's form, to think about this idea of beforeness and inheritance and what we do with the past, or with, like, yeah, the kind of stuff we don't know, stuff that we're left with that we don't know what to do with, and it ended up being, yeah, the kind of way to sort of let that idea of leftoverness become the form itself, if that makes any sense. It's kind of turning the novel inside out and becoming its own shape. This is kind of sounding like an Ouroboros, like it's trying to eat its own tail. But yeah, I'm interested in the relationship between form and function and form and content, and that was, like, that Bowen structure was the best way I could come up with to do that.